Right. One of the things that I'm going to mention is that the Hong Kong branch of IOSH actually asked me to explain the terminology, and between us we've shared the Chinese language to make it easier for the Chinese audience to understand. So hopefully we've got them in the right order and that they make sense to you. What we need to consider here is why addressing good psychological health is very important. And you've got to look at certain aspects of work being an influence on good psychological health. First, you've got the physical aspects such as heat, noise and lighting. And we know that these affect certain psychological processes, both positively and adversely. Noise, for example, may impair the cognitive performance when you're doing certain kinds of tasks. The physical settings of work impact on the level of social interaction between the workforce. The design of open plan offices, for example, may determine the kind of interactions that take place. And finally, the physical environment may offer more or less physical safety, and concerns about accidents and injury are likely to have some effect on psychological well-being. Just for the UK elements, the latest statistics were released by the HSE yesterday, and it shows that 822,000 workers are suffering from work-related stress, depression or anxiety. And this is one of the real big problems that we've got. The first thing I'd like to address is the importance of words. Good psychological health is very important, but research undertaken by Mind in Hong Kong indicates that there's a long way to go in dismantling the stigma around mental health. So when people say that they've got a mental health issue or they've got failing mental health or poor mental health, immediately that creates a challenge for certain individuals because of stigmatization. And when people are stigmatized, it means that people can be isolated, they can be cast out, they can be treated differently. And this is unfortunate because not everybody understands the depth of mental health problems, and certain people have misconceptions about certain diagnoses. And for some, the language that people use can be dismissive. If you're suffering from a mental health issue, it can be offensive or it can actually be hurtful. So the first thing about stigma is, if we can remove the stigma, we can remove a lot of unfair treatment of people that are different. I prefer to address the term as psychological health. There isn't so much stigma surrounding psychological health. And when you look at the statistics, you know, recent surveys showed that 71% of people were unwilling to live with people with mental health issues. 1 in 3 of them were quite willing to end the friendships. 41% of people consider that lack of self-discipline and lack of willpower is the main cause of psychological illness. And a lot of people, unfortunately, still believe that they're going to be penalized or punished or treated differently at work because of their psychological health challenges. And when the surveys have asked people who've been involved in poor psychological health, 55 of them reported that they've actually experienced stigma. So it's clear that the psychological ill health imposes heavy burdens on people. And when it starts to look at Hong Kong, I don't believe that Hong Kong is any different to the United Kingdom or America or Australia. Looking at the figures from the Mind organization in Hong Kong, sadly, too many people still do not accept that psychological ill health is a problem. And because of this, resilience amongst those who do not believe poor psychological health is a problem is usually lessened, because people who think it's not an issue don't develop their coping strategies. And the fact is that poor psychological health can arise from many common environmental, social, personal stresses, life events, lack of exercise, alcohol abuse, financial difficulties. Chronic illness is also a contributor to this. And according to the World Health Organization, 5 of the 10 leading causes of disability worldwide are linked to mental health problems. Things like major depression, schizophrenia, bipolar, alcohol use, obsessive compulsive disorders. So, going on to the workplace factors that are contributing this. The workplace factors include lack of physical and mental space, limited opportunities to take breaks. Low job security will also increase anxiety and stresses. And workplace cultures can also contribute to this. In Hong Kong, you've actually got one of the longest working hours in the week worldwide. In Hong Kong, the average working week is 51 hours per week for an average worker. And again, 46% of Hong Kong employees have worked more than 50 hours per week. And they reckon that research undertaken in 1999 that the psychological health problems really do affect functional and working capacity in a lot of different ways. And that depends on the age of the person that's suffering, the working capacity, how much that's reduced, and again, whatever the disability, the physical disability that's related there. In the European Union, for example, psychological health problems are a major reason for granting disability pensions. The World Health Organization in some recent research have also stated that the biggest organizational factor contributing to poor psychological health is where you've got a non-supportive culture and a poor task environment. And of course, that leads on to physical and social isolation, poor relationships with supervisors. It can lead to violence at work. If you add to that the high uncertainty of work and your job security, the lack of variety in short work cycles, fragmented or meaningless work, then those are also contributory problems that dependence on that. So what is the overlap? Well, the prolonged economic instability can be expected to increase demand for mental health services. And there's a close link between unemployment, deaths, and mental health, psychological health problems, particularly depression and anxiety. So many of those with diagnosable psychological health problems don't actually receive any formal treatment. And this raises the question about, are the current service models fit for purpose? And when I'm talking about current service models, is the health service, is the occupational health service within the organization fit to support workers with psychological disabilities? And the cost of this disability is indirect and direct costs. So you've got the costs of welfare services, you've got the costs of treatment, you've got the costs of disability benefits, travel and access, medication, and also the indirect cost to people who are the carers. It's not a new problem. In Japan, we have this word karoshi, and it's known as overwork death. And again, this leads to the reason why is good psychological health important and what part does work play on it. So when you look at the report from the World Health Organization, those working more than 55 hours a week were likely to have a higher risk of stroke, or 17% of people had a higher risk of dying from ischemic heart disease compared to the people that work normally. And of course, the effects from this are psychological, physical, emotional, interpersonal, behavioral. In China, I believe the word that you use is guolozi, and it's costing, 600,000 people a year suffer from this Chinese word called guolozi. So in many countries, part of the problem is not so much the culture of working hard, but being seen to work and being seen to do so. And this can lead to another condition called presenteeism. If you look at the work of Professor Carey Cooper, and he asked the question, could a culture of presenteeism to be blamed for poor psychological health? He actually answers it in one word, and he says yes. So what is good health? Well, when you look at the World Health Organization, and hopefully the Chinese characters explain this, health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. It's not just merely the absence of disease or infirmity. This was adopted way back in 1946. Yet when you look at the efforts that's put into physical health and psychological health, there's a discrepancy. The efforts are not the same. So in the UK, the other problem with this is as well, we've got to consider, our safety practitioners the right people to deal with psychological health? And do organizations put psychological health in the too difficult to do box? It's something that we do need to consider. In the UK, we have the Health and Social Care Act of 2012, and it talks about parity of esteem. And this means putting the equivalent importance on physical health care with psychological health care, making both treatments equally effective, making both types of treatment safe. And of course, if society is to be judged in the way that it looks after its people, then we must look at the support that's given to helping people retain their good psychological, good physical health. And of course, when it comes to health, under the Health and Safety at Work Act in the UK and under the Health and Safety Acts in the region of Hong Kong, you've actually got the employer's duty of care to look after health. So the parity of esteem, the risk of depression is doubled for people with diabetes, hypertension, coronary heart disease, heart failure, and it's tripled in those people who suffer from strokes, end-stage renal failure, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Again, the House of Commons in the UK found that due to the unmet health needs, we ignored the psychological health. People with serious psychological illnesses are likely to die on average 20 years earlier. And of course, this can affect people in different ways. So when it comes to good physical health, you can't have good psychological health without having good physical health. And of course, 1 in 3 people with cancer, they'll experience at some stage psychological health problems. When people were questioned about physical illnesses and the relationship to psychological illnesses, 49% of people said we didn't receive any support at work. 66% said when they were treated for their physical illness, nobody informed them that they may actually start to suffer psychological ill health. And 60% of people said, well, what sort of treatment am I going to get? And they were told about counselling. 42% said they were informed about better access to information. And at least half of them actually explained that one of the things would have helped them was to have better communication from the people that were helping them. And of course, once treatment stops for physical elements, treatment stops for most of it. Yet we know from the evidence surrounding the research that's been done that the post-treatment phase of a serious long-term illness is the most volatile time, and yet it's the time when people receive the less support and it's a time when they may start to actually suffer from psychological ill health. So you can't have good psychological health without good physical health. And people show that, research shows that people with psychological health problems are more likely to have a preventable physical disease. And this can be for a variety of reasons, things like genetics, low motivation, difficulty in concentrating and planning, lack of support to help them change to have a healthy, to get rid of the unhealthy behaviors. And of course, in certain areas, being less likely to receive the medical help. And healthcare professionals still may assume that your physical symptoms are part of your mental illness and they don't investigate them further. So the effects of this can cause social isolation, low esteem, stigmatization, and discrimination. And of course, mental health problems do come with physical problems as well. For example, somebody who's suffering from psoriasis, which is a dermatological condition of the skin, and it's characterized by painful red sores, and they actually start weeping. People with this type of illness, it's associated, they get stress from people staring at them because they're different. And of course, that can start to make them feel depressed. And stress and depression mainly arise from very severe forms of anxiety. It can also come from the stigmatization and also the rejection and discrimination that people show there. So fatigue, let's just have an example of fatigue can be caused by frustration. It's worry, stress, especially when these people are dealing with the pain, the treatment, the test, the flare-ups. So it's not just the actual illness. Sometimes it's treating the illness that can actually cause the psychological ill health. And research done by Barnett in 2012 found that 30% of people with a long-term physical health condition do have these psychological health problems. So depression, it's been linked to many chronic illnesses such as diabetes, asthma, cancer, cardiovascular disease, and arthritis. Again, schizophrenia and also people with psychological health conditions are going to suffer from sleep disorders. Those sleep disorders, if people are at work, are going to lead to fatigue. That can lead to more accidents in the workplace. And when you start talking about the parity of health and the equality between physical and psychological health, Dr. Brock Chisholm, who was the first Director General of the World Health Organization, he happened to be a psychiatrist, and he famously stated in 1954 that without good psychological health, there can be no true physical health. This is half a century ago, and yet the evidence that was there, the linking the direct relationship between psychological illnesses and psychological health was there. The sad thing is that policy is lacking a long way behind. So let's just have a look at stigma. And is stigma occurring in Hong Kong? There's a lot of stigma attached to psychological ill health. There was some research done in 2011 with young children. And the researchers found that young children had 211 different ways of describing a person who was suffering from poor psychological health. So it's there, we know it's there. And the causes of stigma, well, there we go. The effects it has on the family. It really does involve those who are separated from social and isolated from their social groups. But the biggest cause of stigma is lack of education. Poor understanding of psychological illness is the biggest factor that contributes to and perpetuates the stigma against people who experience poor psychological health. And somebody who doesn't understand how psychological illness works and how it affects people are going to be more vulnerable to those misconceptions and stereotypes about mental health. The role of the media doesn't help either, because as soon as they find a violent act that's connected to somebody who's got a mental health issue or a psychological ill health issue, immediately the headlines are, you know, mental health causes this, mental health causes that. And that makes people think that anybody who suffers from psychological illness is going to be violent. And then you get the language being used as well. Words like crazy and insane and lunatic. Well, people refer these words to people when they're not actually talking about poor psychological health. And the best way to fight the stigma is through education and information. Educate the workforce, educate the population, give them information, and the public information campaigns can be done via courses, via conferences, in work, in schools. And it's really important to delineate that general stigma and develop that plan of action to deal with it. The impact of people at work is quite serious, because here you have a list of reasons of those things that people find at work, what's likely to happen to them. And a survey done by the European Safety and Health Agency, it found that a lot of people actually go to work when they're unfit to do so. And presenteeism starts to creep in. The culture of I've got to be at work, I've got to be seen to be at work. This adds the pressure onto those people at work as well. And if you think about the financial impact, if workers are taking longer to do the tasks, the organisation isn't as productive enough. If they're having difficulty making simple decisions, decisions may be delayed, which affects either safety or affect productivity. Again, psychological illness can make people, they can't concentrate on more than one thing at one time. Sometimes they'll even put off the really challenging work because they don't want to do it. And of course, it's likely to cause personal conflicts at work, personal conflicts with supervisors. But the biggest thing is that if you're in periods of change and new things are coming, it makes finding it difficult to cope with those changes and learning those new ways even more difficult. And of course, this can also be contributed to by the organizational culture of presenteeism. And again, it's the view that is taken of people who decide to stay away when they're ill. Employees who come to work when they're sick are viewed as dedicated workers. And it's held as the norm that the leaders in the organization, they will come to work when they're unwell. This can put pressure on employees to come to work when they're ill. It then negatively affects employee morale. And that employee morale then starts to negatively affect their physical and mental well-being. A lot of business writers nowadays are finding that good psychological health is important, and they're beginning to realize that you've got to treat the person as a whole. So you develop the person, you look at the organization, you think of the body, the mind, the spirit, and the heart. And if you relate this to the body, Stephen Covey said, it's best described as providing them with the physical environment to be productive and to grow, making sure that they get adequate sleep, adequate rest, good holidays. And don't forget, lack of sleep and fatigue, it also makes it easier for people to become susceptible to poor psychological health. You've also got to look at the mind of people and develop the mind and find ways of embracing how they can grow. And one of the ways of doing that is by giving people recognition for providing good work. It means treating people equally, getting people to accept responsibility and the organization to plan ahead so that you're not always reacting to other situations. And again, when it comes to the heart, this is about making people feel good about themselves. This is important with people with psychological illnesses. if you can make somebody feel good about themselves, give them a sense of belonging and help them to develop these positive internal and external relationships, it pays dividends. People will begin to trust them. If it's a leader that's affected, the team will trust them. They'll feel valued, they'll feel happier, and valued people are more productive at work. And within this relationship, you know, they don't get overwhelmed by fear or love or anger or jealousy, guilt or worry. They start to contribute to work. And people who are included tend to have a sense of the fact that they realize they're not perfect, but this also impacts upon their ability to use the social resources as well. And when you look at the spirit, this is creating the legacy and providing them with valid reasons to contribute to the organization. And it's to develop their altruistic sides, but with a bit of realism added there as well. Building that culture of honesty and openness to help employees feel supported and that they are contributing to something good. So it's that feeling of connecting to others and having a unifying force that makes them think, I'm part of this, I'm developing this, I'm needed, I'm respected. And we've known for years that people need various things. And as man has moved from the various ages, you know, we have the hunter-gatherer age where we relied on hunting, then we have the agricultural age where everybody works in agriculture. We've now gone through into the technology age, we're now in the age of wisdom. The main drivers of the agricultural industrial age were men and machines. People in those times weren't necessary, but they were replaceable. And we know about this through the works of Taylor and Ford. But in today's knowledge age, we need people to have brains that are fit, that they've got good psychological health. And again, we can't apply the old industrial age techniques to solve the problems of the knowledge age. So we need to identify those people and involve them in providing the improvements. And even now in the knowledge age, it's even more vital to have practices and policies that support people's psychological health. So, psychological health, what does it do for us? Well, it's the foundation for our physical health. It helps us to think, it helps us to communicate. We build in our resilience to adverse events. It helps us to believe in our self-esteem. It's about how do we communicate to other people? How do we build those relationships? How do I preserve my emotional well-being? And what am I contributing to communities or societies? It helps us to learn. It helps us to express our feelings and manage a range of emotions. Helps us to form those good relationships. It helps us to develop coping strategies and to be able to manage and cope with change and uncertainty. But above all, it helps good psychological health. It helps us to feel good about ourselves, helps us to feel good about what we do. And that's one of the reasons why managers need to learn to say please and thank you, and to actually go up to people and say, thank you for doing that good job. So to summarize, psychologically healthy young people possess emotional, social, and spiritual resilience. Psychologically healthy people have the ability to overcome certain adverse challenges. They can deal better with minor disappointments, major tragedies. These are typical of the life obstacles that we face. And people with good psychological health usually respond to those challenges and frustrations in a positive manner. Yes, they're going to make occasional mistakes, they're going to make occasional slips, but they have the resilience and the all being there to be able to cope with that. And when they do slip, they recognize it and they learn from it and they improve from it. And rather than engaging in lots of self-recrimination, they actually develop plans to make sure that they don't repeat those slips again. You know, there is a range of different people there, from unhealthy to healthy. And of course, the psychologist Abraham Maslow, he realized that psychological health affects us at all our levels, and that there are certain basic human needs. At the bottom of this, there are the survival needs, things like food and water and sleep. But then there's the security needs, the shelter, the safety and the protection. And the social needs going above that, this is where the poor psychological ill health population tend to be neglected, because they don't feel that sense of belonging. They don't get the affection and acceptance from the general population. And of course, this social needs is really important, because human beings are animals and pack animals, and we rely on each other. We're interdependent on each other for a lot of reasons. So going on to that, the one thing is that I've got to say, there's no one way, there's no one size fits all. Every individual is different, every individual is unique. And the treatment regimes for each individual suffering those different psychological problems will be unique to those individuals. So the relationship between the work environment, the psychological environment, is it well understood? The answer would be no, and there's no one way of best treating people. There's definitely a wrong way. And the question is to be asked, are safety practitioners capable of dealing with the complex problems? This is where we need to use our contacts and relationships with the health professionals. The wrong way of treating poor psychological health is just to ignore it and think it'll go away, because it won't happen. If you don't deal with challenges and problems, they're not going to go away. They're just going to get worse. And as they get worse, that person becomes more ill. But you've got to think about safety practitioners. We've got a wide range of skills, some unique skills, and we tend to look at the broader issues. So we are well placed to start bringing together the treatment that's there. But we need the assistance of external organizations. We need the occupational health experts. We need the managers. We need the workforce to work with us. And I think one of the things that the safety practitioner needs to do is to build closer and better relationships with the occupational health profession and the doctors, especially when it comes to treating the individuals. So what can we actually do about it? Well, it's all down to risk assessment and taking a 5-step approach. The first thing is you need the correct policies in place. Leadership is the key here. If leaders show the engagement and commitment to dealing with psychological ill health properly, the rest of the workforce will start to take it seriously. By the leadership starting to take an interest in the welfare of the workforce, there's a phenomenon called the upstairs caring. They do care upstairs. It came from the 1930s experiments that I've forgotten who did it now, but the phenomena was that because the managers were involved with the workforce started to feel that the management actually care, and the phenomena that came from that. And I will remember who did it later. So start to involve your workers, start to involve the representatives, and start to involve external bodies, especially when you're putting your policies, your procedures and your processes together. You cannot adopt a one-size-fits-all. What you've got to remember here, though, that when you go to the external bodies and external carers, the medical professionals, they may be under a higher level or a stricter level of duty of care, especially when it comes to formulating those awareness programs. Start to treat people equally and start to look at business ethics and start to treat people with confidence so that they gain trust in what you're doing is trying to help them. And of course, again, the legal aspects, you've got the duty of care, but do you really want people to come to work who are not well, who may be a risk to other people because of their actions or their thoughts? And of course, when we start looking at this, we've got to keep an open mind, make sure that we only put out the true facts about psychological ill health. Be flexible because one size doesn't fit all. Make sure that you do seek the expert advice. And the biggest thing is listen and give employees the time to talk about their experiences because you can learn a lot for them. And treat psychological health just as you would poor physical health. And don't forget, it's not just about curing the person, it's not just about treating the person. They then need to be integrated back into working life. So you may have to make adjustments for people to do that. And one of the ways that you can take all those 5 steps and put them together, make sure the managers are trained on return to work competencies so that they don't dismiss it as somebody who's just been off. It's a serious part of integrating that person back into work because there will be a certain amount of distrust. You need to make sure that when you involve the workers, make sure that you do the things that educate the workers about the stigma. Stigmatization isn't just words, it can be a look, it can be approach. It can easily cause offense. So the wider benefits, complete inclusion. You're not excluding people, we're all in it together. And the research actually shows that the disabled worker who's back at work is better for it as well. However, the business costs, lots of these, you avoid all the legal costs and the legal arguments. Sometimes in certain situations, making the access for disabled workers better, you're actually making it better for your customers as well. And the one thing here is that it increases employee loyalty. And the research does show that loyal employees tend to be more profitable. It can help you improve your overall level of customer service because you've learned to deal with psychological ill health with your workforce. You can apply those practices to your customers. We're now entering the age of ethical investment. We can sell the diversity in our ethical investment procedures. Again, just think, if you discourage people who are disabled and you don't actually want them to apply, you're narrowing your talent pool. And when I talk about people with disability, all I'll say is just imagine if we didn't encourage Stephen Hawking to go to work, we'd have wasted one of the most fantastic brains that we'd have had, and we would have been lacking all the knowledge that he brought into our society. Again, making those small changes to the work environment, you're increasing your potential customer footfall. You're not just helping the employee, you're helping their family as well, because they retain their independence. And of course, it helps to improve workplace relations, because if they know that the upstairs cares syndrome is applying, then your partnership between your workforce and workers and managers will improve. By the way, the experiment was done by Elton Mayo in the General Western Electric Company, and that's where the someone upstairs cares phenomena comes from, because they found that when managers work closely with the employees tended to respond more positively. But the biggest thing is, by getting people back to work, you're paying them to be at work. You're not having to pay sick pay, you're saving on lost wages. You're not increasing the pressure on other people. And of course, you can sell it. You can sell it to under your corporate social responsibility statement, and shareholders are now beginning to take a bigger interest, and that preserves the company reputation. The wider benefits, government benefits, because they're not having to pay sick pay. The workers are paying tax. They're contributing to their own upkeep. Society benefits because the workers are spending their wages in the local shops. There's all sorts of benefits there. One of the things that the research found was that employed people have less attendance at doctors' surgeries. That reduces the pressure on your health services. If you keep valued staff, you are avoiding unnecessary recruitment costs, unnecessary training costs. And of course, this helps to keep the business more productive because you're not spending money needlessly. And it can also include keeping a client base, because if these people with psychological illnesses are well liked by their customers, if you get rid of them, the customer is likely to transfer their loyalty and their custom to another organization. The personal benefits, well, let's remove the unfair treatments. And by removing the unfair treatment, you start to connect with the person who's unwell. Humans, because of necessity, we've evolved into social beings. We're dependent upon each other. We need to cooperate with each other. And that's enhanced our ability to survive, especially in different times. The survival threats today from physical threats have lessened, but people still have this continued need to affiliate with others. So by keeping people at work, the benefits are that they're paying the way, they can afford financial independence. This can actually improve their own self-esteem, but it also means that their families can live in houses, they can have good food, the children can go on the school trips, they can have the toys. And if you're improving the self-esteem of the individual, you're actually helping to remove that stigmatization. And not being stigmatized at work will want people to continue, want to work, want to contribute. And of course, that creates that structure for life, because work provides a lot of people with a lifetime structure. And of course, by joining in at work and joining in with communities, people are beginning to start realizing this social contact. And human beings, you know, we generally like sharing life with other people, especially where those other people have similar views. Being lonely and isolated has been linked very closely with poor physical health and poor psychological health outcomes. And we need to start removing that so people have this. And there's a growing body of evidence that suggests our bodies actually function better when we're experiencing this sense of togetherness, when I belong to this place. So the actual framework for psychological health, you've got to look at the organization, and the organizational culture has a really strong influence on health and well-being. These organizational cultures, these organizational influences include job control, job design, a feeling of being treated fairly, a feeling that my job is secure. And some organizations actually develop cultures of presenteeism. This has a real detrimental effect on productivity. And you could have a whole seminar on presenteeism. I haven't got the time to look at that today. But then you've got to have a look at managers. Make sure managers are trained to deal with the psychological ill health issues. Make sure they're trained to build the rapport with staff. And the employee with the psychological ill health challenge, they won't feel confident in approaching their managers. So, and this is because the managers have not dealt with it effectively. So make sure that you train your managers to support the people effectively if they do approach them over a psychological ill health issue. It's important that your managers are beginning to realize and recognize the signs of psychological ill health. And they can also recognize when the employees are showing these physical external signs as well. You need to train them to be able to start and open the conversation. And they are sometimes very difficult to do, but they need to be trained and aware. And of course, when it comes to training, it's not just the managers, but also train them about the language and the communication, because the wrong word can stigmatize the worker that's unfortunately affected. And of course, with the employees, you've got to get them to be able to develop a trust in the manager so that they can go forward and report their health concerns, so that they feel that they're able to disclose rather than unable to disclose. Don't forget that employees may not know how to manage their conditions either. They may not even know how to support their colleagues, but all this can be done through an awareness raising regime. And if you do adopt an awareness raising regime in your organization, make sure that you can't identify individuals who may be affected, because again, that can cause the stigma. So the organizational stresses, they can be reduced because of good work design and good management. And just recognize that you cannot always remove workplace pressure. There's a difference between workplace pressure and workplace stress. Again, things that you can do, like the managers and the employees, what can they do? So the managers might not know the best way to help, so you do this with training. But the small things that we say or do can really make a huge difference. Express genuine concern and say that you can help. Letting someone know that you're worried is a good way to open up a conversation. It shows that you care about the person. It shows that you've got time for them and that they do not have to avoid saying things to you or avoid informing you about certain situations. Make sure that you reassure them when you talk to them. The first time that somebody mentions another person's worries is usually that big step to helping them to be able to deal with it. Make sure that when you do approach people that you adopt that patient approach. You can't rush into it. And just be careful, because you may not know the full story, and sometimes the people with psychological issues won't tell you the full story. There'll be other things going on in the background. But just being there, just listening and just trying to help is another way of helping somebody who may want to open up. Don't force the issue. Don't force the employee to talk to you. Try and find a way of persuading them to do that. And don't go behind their back to a medical professional either, because that will cause mistrust, distrust, and it can also affect the relationships there. Sometimes that little act of kindness is the big thing. Can I get you a drink? Do you want a sandwich? Find out what works for the person that you're talking to. What is that little act of kindness that you can show them that shows them that you really care and that you want to help? Don't behave any differently towards them either, because behaving differently can isolate them, or it can cause them to feel as though they're being stigmatized. But don't be afraid of offering kind words. Don't be afraid of offering them a space to talk. And don't be afraid to talk to them in person or by telephone. It's those little acts that really do help. Offer your time and listen, and remember to listen properly. If they don't want support, try and explore the reasons why they don't want support. If they're unsure about getting help, try and persuade them to accept the help. And don't be judgmental in doing that either. because all these things can help you to identify what's getting in the way. And the one thing that you really have to be careful about is at the time that you're trying to help other people and look after other people, you've also got to make sure that you look after yourself. There's various different ways that you can provide the help for employee, but just remember some of the emotions that these employees will be going through, and fear is the biggest one. Sadly, counselling's got a stigma attached to it, and the medical model that was developed to fix what was broken isn't as good as what it can be. And just remember that people receiving counselling are not broken, that they're malleable and they can rewire themselves. You can treat people and you can be successful in that treatment. And a professional counsellor can actually help with that. Coaching is another area where practitioners can use the skills that they've already got. Because again, while coaching isn't a therapy, it can actually be very therapeutic. And the whole process of coaching is talking to people. It's the same as mentoring. You're getting to know the person, you're getting to show that you care. Employee assistance programs can actually work in a lot of different ways. And one of the success factors is that it's not connected internally into the organization. They're usually bought in services. Because they're bought in, the workforce tend to trust them more than they do the internal bits as well. The one thing that you can do is train the workforce. And when you train the workforce, don't train the managers separately from the workers. Train the managers and the workers together. And this is so that they can discuss the challenges and issues and people begin to develop an understanding. There are certain international standards such as 45001. There's now an international standard for dealing with psychological health, ISO 45003, and we'll go on to talk to that in a minute. But in the UK, what we've found is the two largest rises in psychological health absenteeism comes from increased workload and lack of managerial support. And the HSE in the UK have actually said these are two things that apply to all firms of all sizes. Now, again, we have a law in the UK called the Equality Act, and we're not allowed to discriminate against people. In Hong Kong, you've also got a law where people have to make reasonable accommodation. And in the UK, reasonable accommodation is called a reasonable adjustment. However, you've got civil law now that actually says employers do need to make these reasonable accommodations. And it's not just being good enough, and it's not being doing what's best, it's doing what is reasonable. And the reason there is that it's unlawful to treat an employee less favourable on the grounds of their disability. In the Hong Kong case, the Kan Che Sing versus Lucky Dragon Boat, a restaurant owner was found guilty of discriminating against a waiter and was made to pay back wages of a year in compensation. The waiter actually said that I'm having difficulty with my job, and it was psychological impairment. The employer did nothing about it and eventually was taken to court. And there the court judgment is, you can actually see the link that's provided there. So how can ISO 45003 help? Well, this standard covers such aspects of how to identify the conditions, how to identify the circumstances and the workplace demands that have a potential to adversely impact and impair psychological health. It shows you how to identify the primary risk factors, how to deal with them, what can you change to your workplace to deal with that, and also how to identify and control the work-related hazards so that you can manage the psychosocial risk within an occupational health and safety management system. It's an area that too many organisations feel inadequately equipped to deal with. And it's been dealt with in a lot of superficial ways, you know, like the provision of yogurt, the provision of yoga and things like that. One of the worst ways, I think, and it's the reactive way, is the provision of a mental health first aider. You really need to make sure that you look at your organisational context and you understand it, that you've got the correct policies and procedures in place, that you're involving the leader and the workers and you're getting them to participate and working together, that the leaders do make sure that the actions you need to address the psychological ill health are actually documented and they're being addressed, and somebody's checking up to make sure that these things are done. And organisations need to recognise that psychological health and well-being is a multifaceted issue. It needs a holistic, joined-up approach from all areas. Multidisciplinary teams like human resources, health and safety, occupational health, the directors, they've all got to work together to do this. And making the end result, making sure that you don't just make sure that the workers are supported, but where they've been away from work, they may be reluctant to return to work. So you've got to make sure that when they return to work, they're given a chance to rehabilitate and return to work effectively. So a comprehensive understanding of how work affects well-being needs to be taken into account, and make sure that you're ruling out the harmful influences. So tips to give employees. Again, this is about organisational culture and the management buying into this. We're going to deal with this issue. If employees suffer in silence, nothing gets done. If employees start to feel overwhelmed or burnt out, encourage them to take some time off. Encourage them to take leave. Again, don't get them to feel that they've got to be at work all the time. Create the culture where people with mental health issues can speak to somebody that they trust. Doesn't matter whether it's internal or external. Make sure there's an avenue there for them to trust people. Again, get them to understand that if they're having difficulties, they can approach the employer, and get the employer to understand it's unlawful to treat them differently simply because it's a psychological health condition. Get them to understand, yes, we understand that our organisation, our work is important. Get them to share in that vision of someone upstairs cares, and get the managers to make sure that people realise that nothing's more important than their health and well-being. And business leaders need to make sure that there are gaps between their own knowledge and how they're doing things and the support that is actually provided. So try and make sure that there isn't that gap between what we think is happening and what really is happening. We've got to take that proactive approach, a preventative approach, because prevention is always cheaper than cure. And make sure that employees know that they can find and they have access to sources of help, that there are people prepared to help them manage their condition, and keep reinforcing that information frequently. And finally, let's start challenging the myths. It is possible to cure people with psychological illness, and long-term studies have shown that the majority of people with psychological illnesses will show genuine improvement over time, and they can lead stable and productive lives. The second myth is also untrue, and employers who have hired individuals report that they have better than average attendance, that they're punctual, and that they're good or better motivated to keep coming to work. and that their quality of work and their job tenure is just as good as other people. This is an oversimplification simply because everybody is different. Everybody reacts to stress differently, and every different psychological illness has a different effect when subject to stress. People with a variety of medical conditions can find that their condition is made worse by stress. However, the source of personal and job-related stress varies substantially, and it varies between individuals as well. And of course, this is totally untrue. The vast majority of people with psychological illnesses are not mentally unstable. They're not dangerous. They're not going to kill you. They're not going to harm you. And this myth is perpetuated by inaccurate media reports where they want to highlight the effects of a crime because it was committed by somebody with a psychological illness. It's the media and how they portray people with psychological illnesses as being randomly violent. And there's a need amongst employees to recognise psychological health issues as a legitimate workplace concern. As disability costs and absenteeism increases in the workplace, more and more employers are going to be faced with this challenge of developing policies and guidelines to address the issues. There's never a one-size-fits-all. Everybody's different, every organization's different, and every organization needs to take a different approach to dealing with it. But if you don't deal with it, it will not get any better. It will only get worse. And as it gets worse, it will cost the organization in its reputation, in business, in productivity, in employee loyalty. All those things will adversely affect the business. And of course, you may get enforcement action taken against you as well. So there's the sources of information that I've been able to use to give to you today. They're all there, they're all easily traceable. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Tim, for your sharing. And we now move to the Q&A section. If you have any questions, you can put in the chat box or raise your hand using the response button. Okay, Tim, you have a question from a participant. He asked if psychological, not if he believes that psychological support is expensive. Is there any government fund support available in UK, or do we have any figure on hand if we would like to provide such kind of support to the employee in Hong Kong?
The one thing I will say is psychological support is not expensive. It's as expensive as what you want to make it. Now, for sources of help and support, you've got things like Mind in Hong Kong, a charitable organisation. They will always advise you. Now, as regards government funding, I do believe that there are some things in the Chinese area that you may be able to access, but I'm not an expert on that. But the one thing I will say is that if you don't tackle the problem of psychological ill health, it's going to cost you far more in lost reputation, lost productivity, lost employee reliability, lost employee loyalty, and industrial relations problems. Those costs will be far more expensive than simply trying to deal with the problem. Prevention is always cheaper than cure. That's the most honest answer that I can give you.
Okay, thank you, Tim. And there is also another question from the floor. A participant asked, there is no incentive for senior management to implement well-being and health programs which involve time and money costs. How to convince them?
Well, I think the arguments have all been in the presentation. Look at the management time that's going to be spent dealing with ill health. Look at the management time that's going to be spent explaining lost productivity. If you are not tackling psychological ill health and treating it the same as physical ill health, what happens when your orders are delayed getting to the customers? What are the customers going to do? These are all costs that the managers need to be made aware of, because again, if we don't deal with the problem, will they be able to convince the general population that this company is a good company to work for? Sorry. So if workers don't want to go to that company and work for them because they've now got this poor reputation, look at the effects it's going to have on productivity. So it's in everybody's interest to make sure that we deal with it, because if a company isn't profitable, it's going to go bust. If it goes bust, none of them have a job, including the managers. And by the way, one of the big things in Hong Kong with organizations, and correct me if I'm wrong, an organization's reputation is absolutely vital to that organization. What happens when that public reputation gets damaged?
Thank you, Tim. And I found there is another questions from a participant. He asked if it is our immediate supervisor, who is also an employee, who has personality disorder, and how we could offer support to him or her as a subordinate. Any experience to share?
Yeah, I've got an experience to share. I've got loads of experiences to share through supporting people with psychological illnesses. I've got to be very careful how I state this, because I think some of my students are listening. Let's just say that over the course of years, because of the background that I have and the approach that I take with people, I've had to deal with some very, very difficult cases. And the first thing I've found is that when dealing with these people, you've got to talk to them. You've actually got to get them to learn to trust you. Gaining their trust is absolutely vital, because if you don't gain their trust, there'll always be the suspicion of you doing it to get rid of me. You're doing it off for some other adverse reason. But you can't deal with it by ignoring it. So if it is your supervisor, you maybe need to go and talk to the line manager and say, look, you know, there's problems occurring within the team that we need to work together to sort out. You can actually try and talk to the supervisor, but knowing the culture of the hierarchy in Hong Kong, that can always be very difficult. So maybe a confidential chat with the senior manager to actually recognize that maybe this supervisor is causing a problem is a good way. But by ignoring the supervisor and by casting him out, by not approaching him or by avoiding him, that is not going to solve the problem. You don't solve your problems by sticking your head in the sand. You've actually got to approach the person, you know, and have a quiet word. You know, are you okay today? You seem a bit stressed or whatever. Is that offering them those words of kindness is usually the first step to helping them. And it's usually the first step in getting them to accept that they need the help, because it's frequent that people who have psychological conditions don't want to admit it, so they won't go for the help. The one story that I can share with the audience today is when I was working on a railway, we had a very senior manager who believed that people who suffered from stress, people who suffered from anxiety and depression were very, very weak. And he was a rather forceful leader. And because he didn't believe that it couldn't happen to anybody, he didn't develop any coping strategies for when he started to be placed under stressful situation. The sad thing is that because he didn't accept it, when it happened to him, he had no coping strategies. It hit him harder than it hit everybody else. And he was away from work for far longer than he needed to have been, simply because he didn't have those coping strategies in place that helped him to develop the resilience that he needed when he actually started to suffer from the psychological condition he did.
Okay, sure. Thank you, Tim. And we have a question coming. The following one is from a participant. He wants to know, is there any study or scientific evidence for the effectiveness of psychological first aid?
No, as far as I'm aware at the moment, there is no academic studies that supports psychological first aid. There is plenty of studies that show good policies, good management practices, good workforce cohesion is more effective at dealing with it. Now, the whole Mental First Aid Association, as far as I'm aware, has been built on a myth that these mental health first aiders can deal with the problem. They're only a solution. They're only the first part in dealing with it, because generally speaking, where you've got these problems in the workplace, it stems from relationships, it stems from organizational policies and procedures. It can even stem from organizational culture. The mental first aider hasn't got the abilities, nor the powers, nor possibly the influence to correct any of those. This is why you need the managers working together with the workers' representatives and the workers.
Thank you. And there's also a question from a participant. He asked, what health promotion initiative would you recommend to Hong Kong corporation while long working hours is a norm here?
Right, this is a topic on presenteeism. There's a whole argument about presenteeism and corporate culture working long hours. Working long hours is counterproductive, because just because somebody's at work, it doesn't mean to say that they're being effective. If they're fatigued, they're not thinking about what they're doing fully, they're not concentrating properly, so they aren't being productive. There are lots of studies surrounding presenteeism, and what I can do, Michael, I've got some good resources on presenteeism, and I know IOSH are looking at it, but if I sent these to you, or if I sent them to Alan, could you share these sources with the members?
Certainly, if you want to send them to me, we can circulate them with the post-event survey email that goes out to all the attendees.
Yeah, right. Thanks for that, mate. Because the whole thing about presenteeism, it's a complete, it could be a whole day's seminar on what causes presenteeism, and it's so complex and complicated, but it comes down to adopting the correct organizational culture and adopting the upstairs someone cares syndrome that Elton Mayo identified when he was working at Western General Electric in 1930.
Okay, thank you. And
in fact, Alan, if they want to look at the upstairs care syndrome, if people type in the internet Elton Mayo and the Hawthorne studies, you can actually find a lot of good resources around that as well.
Okay, thank you. And there is also a question from a participant. He asked, do you agree there is a culture or phenomenon in Hong Kong that employees of their supervisors expect them to do a little bit better than their best as the minimum requirement?
Yeah. Employees don't go to work not wanting to do their best. I don't believe that any employee goes to work deliberately to sabotage work, especially if they've got good psychological health. The culture of wanting people to do their best is a positive one, but you've then got to have the correct approaches to helping that employee do that. So you might have to train them better, or you may have to give them better equipment. It's akin to the old days of when the employee did something wrong, we'll blame the employee because they're at fault. It lets the management side off the hook. So with this is, yes, there's nothing wrong in encouraging the workers to be effective for as much of the time as they can, but then you've got to make sure that the policies, the process, the procedures, and the equipment and the human resource to do that. Because otherwise, all you're going to do is break the human being.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. Let me check if there is any missing questions. It seems all questions have been answered. Thank you.
Good.
So do you have any more thing to add or share with participants now?
The one study that shows the effectiveness of managers and workforces working together. And the sad thing was that when Elton Mayo actually reported on his experiments, the Hawthorne experiments, he didn't record the fact that when managers work closely together with the employees, you start to develop trust. And once you start to develop trust, you then get improved communications, improved loyalty, and it leads to more productivity. It's the old thing that if you want people to work for you, you've got to treat them well. And as Richard Branson said, if you treat people well and train them to do the job, yes, the risk is that they will leave and work for somebody else. He says the real trick is that you train people so that other people want to employ them, but you treat them well enough so they don't want to leave you.
Okay, thank you very much for your sharing, Tim, and I hope the participant here can learn something about psychological well-being. So thank you very much for joining the webinar tonight, and I believe this is the end of today's sharing. Please be reminded to fill in the survey that will be sent to your email afterwards, and see you next time.